Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 30th of January. I'm Erin Viner, and this is IBA News broadcasting from Jerusalem. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu today tried to downplay the diplomatic spat with the United States over his upcoming address to Congress, calling it a procedural issue that can be resolved. He went on to say, however, that if Iran obtains nuclear arms, that is an issue that will be far more difficult to solve, emphasizing that is the reason that his administration remains so focused on that prospect. Netanyahu made the remarks during a visit to troops wounded in Wednesday's attack by Hezbollah on the northern border that killed a soldier and an officer. The New York Times is reporting that the Prime Minister reached out to leading U.S. Democrats by phone in an effort to ease tensions surrounding his slated address to the Joint House about Iran, during which he is widely expected to lobby against the White House position over nuclear negotiations with the Islamic Republic. Netanyahu insists that Tehran is opening new fronts against Israel with the use of terror in the Middle East, as well as throughout the entire world. Meanwhile, in the north, the IDF continues to remain on alert.
Unified Force Commander and Head of Mission, Major General Portolano, was in contact with the parties, in close contact with the parties throughout the day, 24/7. We kept an open channel of communication, which is still open now, and it's always open, in order to ask the party to exercise maximum restraints and to ensure that the security situation in the south was reestablished and was stable at the moment.
The Hezbollah attack targeted the IDF convoy in the disputed area of Mount Dov, which is a narrow 2.5-kilometer wide strip at the intersection of the Lebanese-Syrian border on Israel's side of the Golan Heights. I asked Wall Street Journal contributor Amos Asael for his analysis of this and other Hezbollah strategies.
I don't think there is, in the tactical sense, much of an innovation here. This has been part of the broad front that they created between Israel and Lebanon. And the context in which their attack came is clearly the attack that took place last week in Syria, and I therefore don't think that too much significance should be attributed to the location.
Do you believe that UN Resolution 1701, that has mostly kept the quiet along the northern border since the end of the Second Lebanon War, has now been rendered null and void?
On the contrary, I think that the UN's functioning yesterday was actually quite surprisingly effective, and it was greeted as such within Israel, including by the governmental parts that one might expect to be more hostile to this United Nations force. First of all, because these governmental circles today represent the Likud, and secondly, because this UN force was created by a government that was led by Kadima, and specifically by Tzipi Livni. So we would expect people who are in office, thanks to Netanyahu, to be critical of the UN in this context, but they weren't such, because their functioning yesterday was actually efficient and resolute and also effective.
Now, Hezbollah made good, basically, on its vow to avenge the attack you talked about earlier, the alleged Israeli airstrike on Hezbollah and Iranian forces. Has it, in effect, earned a degree of deterrence that will make it more difficult for the IDF to attack targets in Syria?
It's not my impression, although time will tell. My impression is that the IDF, actually the government of Israel, made a clear statement here strategically that it will not tolerate an expansion of Hezbollah's presence in Lebanon into Syria. This Israeli statement was made plain not only by the current government, but also by the opposition. Yesterday on TV, it was reiterated by Herzog and by his candidate for defense minister, Amos Yadlin. This is a broad Israeli consensus that an attempt by Hezbollah to set up shop in Syria, even before activating anything, just arriving there, will be, from Israel's viewpoint, intolerable, and Israel will respond as swiftly and as harshly as it did last week. And if this means that Hezbollah, in response, tries to set up some fire along the Lebanese border, then the IDF will respond.
Dr. Jonathan Spire of the Gloria Center discussed with IBA's Aryeh O'Sullivan what, if any, obstacles are faced by Hezbollah in operating against Israel.
What are the restraints on Hezbollah? Hezbollah is, of course, Hezbollah and Iran are engaged in a whole number of conflicts all the way across the region right now. Iran is engaged in active wars in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, with Sunni jihadi attacks taking place in Lebanon. So they really do have their hands full, and Hezbollah, as an Iranian client, is actively involved also in Iraq, very much also in Syria, and also in Lebanon, Hezbollah's home ground. So they're very, very busy at the moment, which would lead one to assume that they will be very wary before opening a front with Israel. But it appears, at least in the last 24 hours, that when it comes to the need to respond to the killing of Jihad Mugnir and the others, and the IRGC general al-Baghdadi, nevertheless, they were willing to take quite a dramatic step.
It looks like Hezbollah is being led by rational people.
Hezbollah is strategically ideological, but tactically rational. Strategically, we can argue, I'm sure you don't think, and neither do any of us, that Shia Islamism and the desire to destroy Israel and have the Mahdi return is exactly rational. This is the Hezbollah strategic view. But when it comes to operating on a day-by-day or week-by-week basis to advance that eventual goal, then for sure the aspects of profit and loss, of cost and benefit, do apply with regard to Hezbollah. These are not simply a bunch of irrational lunatics running around, and if they were, they wouldn't have got as far as they've got in the course of the last 3 decades.
This is in very close proximity to the Israeli elections, and I'm wondering how much of that had a part to play in Israel's decision to let this die out.
Yeah, I think this is a very good question. I think a lot of foreign analysis overseas has made the mistaken assumption that Israeli governments in months prior to elections are more likely to indulge in military adventures, imagining that this will somehow recruit the support of the Israeli public. Of course, as you and I know, and as people in Israel know, this is not the case. If anything, the reverse is the case, that Israeli governments are more likely to be risk-averse in the months just prior to an election, because the last thing an Israeli leader wants is to conduct an election campaign in the context of, or the immediate aftermath of, a bloody and inconclusive engagement with one or another of Israel's enemies. And most of Israel's engagements with its enemies now, unfortunately, end in a bloody and inconclusive way, whether that is with Hamas, with Hezbollah, or with whoever else. So I tend to think there may well be, of course I can't be in the mind of the Israeli Prime Minister, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was some kind of thinking of, well, we don't actually want to get into a huge adventure right now, just a few weeks away from the elections. Of course, we should perhaps also then assume from that possibly this round has not been concluded, and that possibly after March 17th there will be some additional retribution to be exacted from Hezbollah by the government of Israel for what took place in the last 24 hours.
Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi today cut short his participation at the African Union Summit in Ethiopia to return home to contend with 4 separate attacks against his security forces by Islamist extremists that killed at least 30 personnel in the Sinai. Responsibility has been claimed by the Ansar Bait al-Maqdis terror group, now calling itself the Sinai Province after swearing allegiance to the Islamic State last year, in overnight violence that has been described as the bloodiest in years. Most of the casualties occurred in El Arish, where a military hotel and base were bombed in the provincial capital. 5 others are in critical condition, and the death toll is likely to rise. Turning to the elections here at home, and the campaign for the March 17th vote can now begin in earnest, now that the deadline is passed for parties wanting to run to submit their official final lists of candidates to the Central Elections Committee late last night. The total number of parties running for Knesset is 26. The factions finished making last-minute adjustments just ahead of filing their rosters. After soccer legend Eli Ohana withdrew from Habayta UD yesterday morning, it scrambled to find another well-known candidate to replace him without success and handed in the list at the last possible minute, with member of Knesset Mordechai Yogev filling the 8th spot. Despite several rumors that Likud would either run on a joint list with Habayta UD or unite with Kulanu, the only parties to actually form joint lists at the last moment were former Shas leader Eli Yishai's Yachad with Otzma Yehudit. Shas had 2 significant changes from the 2013 elections, in addition to the MKs who left prior to the election period. MK Amnon Cohen, who served as chairman of the Knesset Control Committee, announced that he was quitting political life and was replaced by MK Yoav Ben-Tzur. The other major change is the absence of one of the Shas founders and long-standing MKs, Nissim Ze'ev, who became increasingly critical of party chairman Aryeh Deri in recent months, accusing him of acting like a dictator. Two small parties submitted lists with rather graphic names. One, Protecting Our Children, Stop Feeding Them Porn. And the faction formerly known as the Greens changed its name to The Greens Don't Give a That was a four-letter word beginning with F, and I'll let you use your imaginations. Two of the latest public opinion polls show Prime Minister Netanyahu's ruling Likud party garnering just one seat more than the Zionist camp merger by Isaac Herzog and Tzipi Livni for the first time in weeks, while a third survey shows Likud coming in second. Results published in the Ma'ariv newspaper show Likud squeaking past the Zionist camp list, 25 mandates to 24, with the Beit Yehudi dropping to 14 in a shift being attributed to a fierce backlash over the loss of Eli Ohana. The United Arab parties came in fourth with 12 seats. Yesh Atid had 11, and United Torah Judaism and Kulanu both received 8. Shas was next with 7, Meretz had 6, and Avigdor Lieberman's Israel Beitenu continues its free fall with just 5. Meanwhile, the Walla News website published its own findings today, with Likud again beating the Zionist camp by a single seat, 27 to 26. Beit Yehudi saw a dramatic dip in the number of projected mandates to just 12. And last, the Smith Globes poll reflects a win by the Zionist camp at 25 seats, Likud at 24, Beit Yehudi 16, the United Arab List 12, Yesh Atid 9, while coming in with 8 were Shas, UTJ, and Kulanu. All of the surveys were held ahead of the late-night merger of Eli Yishai's party with Otzma Yehudit. In another controversy straining already frayed relations between Washington and Jerusalem, the U.S. State Department announced that the U.S. government once funded the left-wing One Voice group that is helping to campaign against Prime Minister Netanyahu, but that no grants were given since last November. Two Republicans, Senator Ted Cruz of Texas and New York Congressman Lee Zeldin, sent a letter to Secretary of State John Kerry calling for an investigation by the State Department Inspector General whether One Voice used any of the grant money in violation of its status as a tax-exempt organization. Spokeswoman Jen Psaki denied allegations that the State Department is funding a campaign to dump Netanyahu in the Knesset election.
The U.S. government grant to One Voice Israel was for $233,500. The duration of this grant, as I mentioned yesterday, but just to reconfirm, was from September 23rd, 2013 through November 30th, 2014. No payment was made to One Voice after November 2014.
And the project was again for what?
Well, the project was to support efforts to support a two-state solution.
Despite the fact that you said that yesterday without the specific dollar amount of money, there was another report emerged today that says that the State Department is funding an anti-Netanyahu lobbying campaign ahead of the Israeli election. Can you just say once and for all whether that there is any shred of proof for that, or has your looking into it uncovered some kind of funding for this purpose?
No, it's an absolutely false report. The reports were stemming from inaccurate reporting and a lack of reporting, perhaps I should say, on this grant that I've given you many details on.
Bids for 450 tenders to build new housing units in 4 settlements were posted on the Government Lands Authority website immediately prompting widespread condemnation from rights groups. The head of the Terrestrial Jerusalem group, Daniel Siderman, called the move political in nature, signaling the opening of the settlement floodgates that are unlikely to close before the March 17th elections. The announcement is the first since October 2014. 112 new homes will be added to Adam, 156 in Elkanah, 78 in Alfei Menashe, and 84 in Kiryat Arba. Chagit Ofran of Peace Now is accusing the government of trying to create facts on the ground ahead of the election. The Ministry of Construction responded by saying that the tenders are not new and are rather being remarketed after failing last year. As major questions over his death linger, the body of Argentina's state prosecutor, Alberto Nisman, has been buried. There was a heavy security presence outside the Jewish cemetery in Buenos Aires as mourners arrived to pay their respects, and others demanding justice awaited the funeral procession. The 51-year-old jurist was shot to death on January 18th, just one day before he was scheduled to give congressional testimony Over his allegations, President Cristina Fernandez attempted to derail his investigation into Iran's responsibility for the bombing of the Jewish Community Center in 1994. Opinion polls show that the majority of Argentinians believe that they will never know how Nisman died. And sadly, many of the 85 people killed in that terror attack are also buried in the Tablada cemetery, where Nisman's grave is now located, and many are referring to him as the 86th victim. Renowned conductor Israel Inon unexpectedly collapsed and died late last night in the Swiss city of Lucerne. The 59-year-old maestro was in the middle of leading an Alpine symphony by German composer Richard Strauss when he suddenly slumped. According to Swiss media reports, Inon sustained a severe head wound after plunging off stage and died before an ambulance could arrive at the hall. He was born in 1956 in Kfar Saba and studied conducting, musical theory, and composition at the Samuel Rubin Academy of Music in Tel Aviv, as well as the Rubin Academy of Music in Jerusalem. During his career, Inon was known for primarily presenting the works of Jewish musicians who perished during the Holocaust. This week's observance of International Holocaust Remembrance Day served to emphasize the plight faced by Jews in France over whether they should remain in or leave the nation that has been suffering a severe rise in anti-Semitic attacks. We get more in this report from IBA's Margot Dukevich.
In a passionate speech marking International Holocaust Remembrance Day and the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, French President François Hollande urged French Jews to remain in France. The recent spate of terror attacks in Paris, in which 17 people were killed, including 4 French Jews at a Paris supermarket, and the rise in anti-Semitic attacks have spurred many French Jews to pack their bags and head for Israel. Our country would no longer be France without you, Hollande said at the Shoah Memorial Museum in Paris. If terrorists succeed in driving you away, they will have achieved their goals. A report released yesterday by the Jewish Community Security Service in France that monitors anti-Semitism in the country revealed that the number of anti-Semitic attacks in 2014 reached 851, almost double the number from the previous year. Some members of France's 550,000-strong Jewish community believe they are being targeted because of their religious belief. This, coupled with the recent terror attacks that led to increased security of Jewish institutions and synagogues, has motivated many to move to Israel. Stivola Legendre has already bought his plane ticket to Israel, but says he's sad to be leaving. The facts are that people have died for being Jewish in France, Daniel Ben-Haim, the French director of the Jewish agency, says. There is no magic solution, delicatessen owner Florence Kahn says. Israel needs diaspora Jews. Leaving is not a solution. Longtime resident of France, American-born Rabbi Stephen Berkovitz believes many of the French Jews leaving France for Israel are doing so because they're in fear. He insists the only way to solve the situation is through dialogue with the Muslim community.
If we can build stronger relations with our Muslim brothers who indeed want to dialogue with us, it will make us feel secure. And also, we as Jews have to understand that Muslims are indeed victims of daily discrimination that is not yet documented. And for me, that's the tragedy, the irony of the current situation.
With Israel estimating thousands of French Jews will make Aliyah this year, those remaining in France continue to debate whether they should stay or leave. Nearly 11,500 kilometers away in Buenos Aires, members of Argentina's Jewish community boycotted the government's Holocaust memorial services, marking International Holocaust Remembrance Day, to protest the mysterious death of Alberto Nisman, the prosecutor who led the investigation into the 1994 bombing of the Amir Jewish Center that killed 85 people and was found dead in his apartment on January 18th. Nisman had accused his government of covering up Iran's alleged role in the bombing. Gathered at Amir headquarters to remember those who perished at the hands of the Nazis, members of the Jewish community demanded the government investigate thoroughly the causes of Nisman's death. Margot Dukevich, IBA News.
Taking a sharp turn to sports, and it was a dramatic night at Yad Eliyahu Arena as defending EuroLeague champions Maccabi Tel Aviv raced back from a double-digit deficit to defeat Real Madrid in a classic confrontation that was a rematch of last year's title game. The tense affair came down to the closing seconds as Maccabi held on for a 90-86 victory when Joe Alexander made 2 clutch free throws and Real superstar Sergio Rodriguez committed a turnover. Maccabi's triumph before a jam-packed stadium lifted its Final 16 record to 4-1 and a first-place tie in the group with Real Madrid. Maccabi's big man Sofo dominated early play and finished with 17 points and 8 rebounds, while 5 Tel Aviv players scored in double digits. Felipe Reyes led the Spaniards with 20 points and 11 rebounds. In local finance, the shekel today put in a mixed performance in foreign currency trading, and due to the closure of the stock market on Fridays, here's a look at the closing numbers for the week. Well, it's been pretty chilly outside today, but the IBA weather team tells us that tomorrow we can expect clear conditions and a slight rise in temperatures. Here's the forecast at home and abroad over the next 24 hours. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. I'll be back tomorrow with the latest breaking news from Israel. I'm Erin Viner, wishing you a good evening and Shabbat Shalom from Jerusalem.